I have 1:29 on my clock, and I just wanted to unmute myself so that I could make sure everyone can hear me. So if you could just put in the chat box. All right, we got one yes. So I'm hoping. All right, excellent. Thank you. I'm going to get started right at 1:30 because this is a very intense topic that's been condensed down to about 20 to 25 minutes. So I want to try and give everybody their time's worth. So, there's 1:30. So I will get started right away. Welcome and thank you for coming. This is going to be a really basic intro to photo digitization. And of course, there's lots of resources out there, and I also have a lot of them listed at the end of my slideshow here. So you can dig in some more just from this intro. I'm going to be leaving about 5 to 10 minutes at the end to try and address any questions that might come up. So if you do have any questions, throw them in the chat. I might not see them immediately, and maybe I'll answer them as we go. So I'm just going to kind of power through and then do questions at the end. And a little bit about myself. My name is Steph Kalm. I am the head of technical services at the State Historical Society of North Dakota. I got into digitization about 2012, and I basically had to start a digitization program from scratch. So I really had to dig in and teach myself a lot of this stuff. So I've learned a lot in the past few years, and it's all been distilled down into these few slides for you. And one downfall of a webinar is that you don't always know who is in your audience. So some of this stuff, especially at the beginning of the slides, is going to be some basic definitions, just so that we're kind of all on the same page. We're using the same vocabulary. Let's see if technology is my friend here. Where's my, there we go, okay. Digitization definition. So basically, we're taking something that exists in an analog and we're making it a digital format. And my big mantra, and something that I will repeat over and over and over again, is that digitization is about access, not preservation. You don't want to digitize something and then throw away your paper copy, because digital preservation is so difficult and it's an involved process. So I would never advise people to digitize something and throw it away. I've heard way too many horror stories of people that have done this kind of thing, and then the digital file just disappears and then you have nothing. So just if you take one thing away from this session today, please take that digitization is about access, not the preservation part. And some more vocabulary. I know everybody's really excited to learn vocabulary after lunch. So these are just really brief definitions, but they're things that you will encounter when you decide to go about a photo digitization project. So resolution. Basically, the higher the resolution, the finer amount of detail that's available. And a lot of times, a higher resolution isn't going to get you more detail in a photo if the photo is cruddy to start with. So you kind of have to balance your needs and your wants. DPI or PPI, both of those can be used interchangeably. It depends on who you're talking to. And that is the measurement of the resolution. So basically, the more dots, the more detail is visible in the photo. Also means higher file size. So you have to take that into account when you're digitizing photos. The higher resolution, the more dots you're using, the higher file size you're going to use, and the more storage capacity you're going to need. And storage isn't always cheap or easy to come by. Color depth, also known as bit depth. This is the number of bits used to indicate the color or a single single pixel. So some of the examples that you'll see is grayscale, black and white, color. Black and white is going to be your lower file sizes, but you're not going to get as much detail. Typically, you'd only use that for text. I'd never recommend using that for photographs. Grayscale is a good option, especially for black and white photos, which seems kind of weird considering the vocabulary here, but grayscale is usually a good option for black and white photos. And then of course color. And you can have different variations of color depth with the color option. And then format, and that's the standard by which the information is encoded. So typically that's your file name. So .jpeg, .tiff, .pdf. And each one of those options is going to have its own issues, and whether it's how to preserve them or how big they are or if there's any compression. And we're going to talk about compression here in just a second. So compression is something in computer land that different file standards are going to use to reduce the file size. And you might not even be aware of it, but some formats will automatically use compression. So you have to kind of know which ones are compressed and which ones aren't. And those are easily found online. The examples of compression are lossless, lossy, uncompressed. Lossless is still a form of compression. It's still going to make your file size smaller. And basically what it's doing is it's ditching little bits of information, and it kind of extrapolates that later. But lossless is still a compression, and so you're still going to be losing information, but it's better to rebuild things from. Lossy is typically associated with your JPEG formats. It's a more intense compression, and you will lose information with lossy compression. Uncompressed is typically what's used for preservation formats. So if it's something you want to scan and you want to keep it for the long term, you probably want the uncompressed format, because then you can make, the different shareable formats. Like if you have TIFF is an uncompressed format, and if you keep that copy, you can make other compressed copies, for sending people or through email or whatever you want to do. And then metadata, and this is where a lot of times photo digitization projects get tripped up, is somebody does a huge scanning project, but they don't put any metadata with those objects. So there's nothing to explain what it is. There's no descriptive information. And there's three main types of that. There's administrative, descriptive, and structural. Administrative is going to tell you things about the actual file. So it's going to tell you its format, its size, all the fun computer stuff. Descriptive is going to be what is actually in that picture. So it might be a picture of a man and a dog. So there's your description. Very, very basic description, but a description. And then structural, typically you might not have structural metadata for photo projects. It basically tells you how things are related to the other objects. So say you have a book, it tells you that page 2 is before page 3. It's that kind of metadata. And then copyright. I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with the term copyright, but that's something to take into account when you're doing a photo digitization project, because there could be several different layers of copyright that could be associated with that image. And then platform. So it's going to be a major piece of software or an operating system. It's basically something that you're going to use to put your photos out there. Because again, you want to digitize stuff to make it accessible to people. And this is just a basic graphic kind of showing you the digitization life cycle. So you start by selecting what you're going to do, you make the file, you describe it, and then you have to manage it. And so a lot of people think that, you know, scanning is just laying something down on a scanner, putting it out there, and boom, it's done. Well, now you've got to manage that content. And so it's a whole cycle. So we're going to start on that life cycle with selecting things that you don't necessarily want to digitize everything you have. Maybe that's a goal you have, but maybe you want to start smaller, just see where you want to go. So here are some things that you could start with just to make them more accessible. So high interest, high demand items, something in your organization or something in your family might have high interest over other things. Like grandpa rode in the rodeo. So maybe we want to start with his rodeo photos, since most people are going to be interested in those. Physically fragile things. This is another good way to make them accessible without damaging the original. Damaged things. So if you have something that is potentially maybe growing something, which is really terrifying, but you want to maybe digitize it before it gets worse. Unique things, obviously, you know, people want to see things that they haven't seen before. Another good thing is stuff that fits on your scanner. If you have bigger, large format things, there are ways to kind of stitch things together, but that it definitely goes beyond the scope of an intro to digitization class. And then the other thing too, you should have rights to it, or it's in the public domain. You don't want to put things out there that people say, hey, that's mine, and you could get into some trouble with that. So a few other things to consider before you go crazy digitizing things, because it is very easy to start digitizing things, but then maintaining them is hard. Storage capacity. Computer storage isn't cheap. It's gotten cheaper as the years have gone by, but it's still, especially if you're going to be doing uncompressed formats, it takes up a lot of space. And you also have to think about, like here at the state, we're not allowed to put anything onto the cloud. So we have to use other storage methods rather than the cloud. Storage tends to be cheaper. Well, it is cheaper. But then you're also putting your content into another company's hands. So you have to balance your organization's rules and policies with what you want to get accomplished. Backups. Do you have the capability of backing up your info? And it's always good to know where your stuff is being backed up, if it is being backed up, because like here at the state, ITD says that they back up things, but I don't really know the specifics. And so you should always know exactly where your stuff is going and who has it and who has access to it, because it just by people having access to your stuff, it can potentially cause some problems with stuff being accidentally deleted or maliciously deleted. You just don't know. Platform. What platform are you going to use to provide access? And this is something you'd have to do research on to find things that will fit your criteria, because every person, every organization is different. I'm going to talk about later in the slides, I'm going to talk about some potential platforms that you can use. And I kind of mix match between stuff that's tended to be used in like archives, museums, with things that can be used by general people. And then what standards are you going to use to digitize your stuff? You should really, before you start digitizing, have a plan. You know, I want them uncompressed. I want them at this DPI, you know, just so you have consistency across your whole collection that you're going to make. And then how to digitize creating. That's almost really is the easiest part because a lot of the software out there is pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty intuitive. They have different modes. Like I've got that little image in the corner of the Epson scan. Up at the top there, there's a mode. And if you do office mode, it basically sets all the settings for you. And then there's also professional mode where you can change the settings to fit what you're looking for. So again, you want to figure out how much resolution do I need? And I've got some standards too coming up in the slides. Choose a scanner that's based on your needs. A lot of scanners are pretty inexpensive and do a fantastic job of digitizing photos. Are you going to need additional software? Like if you want to manipulate those images beyond the scanner software's capabilities, you want to look into what it's going to cost for, say, like something like Photoshop, or if you want to use an open source like IrfanView, something that'll manipulate the image to what you want to display to people. And then choose a file naming schema, something that makes it unique to that image and you're able to find it again easily. And then make sure you have a computer with sufficient storage and image manipulation capabilities, because sometimes computers won't have enough memory to process those big TIFF files. So if you're going to be doing uncompressed things, you want to make sure that you have a computer that can handle the load. So some best practices for photos, file format, TIFF for the preservation copy, because that's uncompressed. You're not losing any data in that. JPEG for your access copy. And these are kind of the best standards because they're the most widely used. And so it makes it easier for sharing and other things. But again, TIFFs are going to be huge, JPEGs are going to be smaller. So how much storage have you got? Compression, lossless is usually good enough. It's going to keep the file size down. Ideally, you would probably want to use uncompressed, but that goes back to that TIFF preservation copy. But lossless usually is, good enough for creating access for something. Color, usually color or grayscale for photos. You don't want to go with black and white because black and white is just going to look terrible and it doesn't have enough information in it. Bit depth of 16 and then a resolution of 600. 600 isn't crazy high, isn't crazy low. It makes it still a higher size file, but typically for photos, 600 is recognized as a best practice. So describing what you've got, and depending on what you're digitizing for, if you're doing it for an organization, typically you're gonna have access or you're gonna want access to something where there's a standard like Dublin Core or MODS or METs. Dublin Core is definitely gonna be your better option for entry-level metadata. Typically MODS and METs are a little more advanced and usually used on larger collections. Think about how people will access your information and then choose the fields that you will include for descriptive access. So how do you think people are going to use your collection? How do you want to use your collection? I mean, are there things that you would be searching for over and over and over again? Be consistent. That's the biggest thing. As with any kind of cataloging, you want to try and keep your data clean. You want to keep using the same terms. Preferably, you want to use some kind of vocabulary, some kind of national vocabulary for things like subject, genre, and there's lots of different vocabularies out there, and they're mostly online, ready to go, so they're not hard to find. And then use formats like W3C for date entry. So your dates will usually run something like 2019-04-18. So it's more along the European standard, but that really helps with running reports and sorting things. And then writestatement.org for write statements. So can people use your stuff freely, Or are you going to have some restrictions on it? And can they use it freely? Is there copyright on it? These are all things that people are going to want to know. And if you have a nice statement there, they'll have an easy way to understand without having to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. So here's some examples. These were all done using the standards above. So you've got good definition. You can see everybody. The original photo isn't the greatest, so that kind of shows there. And again, these were done with grayscale, I believe. And so these are black and white photos that were scanned in grayscale. And you get, this one actually I think was done in color. But then after you've done all of your digitizing, you're gonna wanna manage it. So again, organizational structure for your files, be consistent. If you're planning on saving these for the long term, you preferably want 3 copies in different locations. So say your area is prone to flooding. You don't want 3 copies in your town. You want 3 copies. You want 1 copy with you. You want 1 copy in a different region. You know, minimum 2, preferably 3. And you're gonna have to maintain the storage in the computer system. And you're gonna just have to make sure that your stuff isn't being deleted or disappearing. So it's an active process. And again, digitization is about access. So how people will access your images is very important. Decide what you want them to access. Maybe you'll digitize some stuff, but not all of it will go on the platform. And then your choice of platform will typically affect your choice of metadata. So some possible platforms, I kind of have a mix here of what are considered professional platforms and other ones that are considered more social media type things. Content DM is typically the big one in the library, archive, museum field. It does have its own drawbacks on the back end, and it can be a more expensive solution if you're looking for something, you know, to start a project on low dollar amount, which a lot of us are. There is Luna, which is another basically like Content DM, just a little bit different. And then Flickr and History Pin are both free, but things to consider too when you're doing these free sites is you need to look at their licensing options and see what kinds of limitations they might impose on your images, or if they might take some of the rights to your images. You have to really pay attention when you're posting that stuff. Even something like Facebook could be easy enough for you to make access to your photos. And then the bottom 3 are all open source software. And if you're not familiar with open source, it's free, which is cool and keeps you on that low end of cost, but it's free like free kittens. Hey, they're cute and they're furry and they're awesome at first, but then you have to take care of them. So if you don't have a lot of computer savvy, or you don't have access to people with computer like programming skills, I wouldn't recommend open source. In fact, when I see the word open source, I break out in hives a lot. So it can be a good solution for somebody that has the skills, but it does take a lot of maintenance and extra stuff. So these are some of the standards that for digitizing images. FAGI and the NARA technical guidelines tend to be a little bit more on the technical end of thing and very specific. So if that's something you're looking for, awesome, rock those guys. The CDP digital images, I think, is a lot more accessible. It's somewhat outdated. I think it's probably 10 or 11 years old, but it's got the basics in there and it's really easy to follow. I used a lot from that when I first started. And then the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, they have all of their guidelines and standards up on the web, really easy to follow. Dublin Core is a really easy entry-level metadata standard. And then here's some resources for different things. So like the Library of Congress personal archiving will get a little bit into digitization and taking care of your stuff. Digital NZ is obviously Digital New Zealand. So you get some of that awesome British spelling in there, but it's got good information. The digital copyright slider is by far, I think, one of the best ways to tell if something is in copyright. I think it runs on Flash still, and so it may or may not work. It worked when I checked the link last week. So, but really, really easy to use copyright slider. And then there's digital preservation at the Library of Congress, and then the Digital Preservation Coalition. So digital preservation is going to go more into if you're keeping those images for the long term, how to take care of them and make sure that they stay what they're supposed to be. And that is probably a whole other day workshop on digital preservation, but it gives some of the basics, especially the Library of Congress site. All right, we got 5 minutes left. I ended right on time here. Here's my contact information. Feel free, if you guys have questions, you need any kind of help with this, let me know. I love answering questions about this stuff. I've been doing it for a while. So does anybody have any questions that they want to ask me now? You can type them in the chat. Whatever works. I know it was a lot of information all at once. I know that. So if you need some time to digest and then come up with questions, I am perfectly okay with that. You can definitely contact me later. Slides are negatives. So we have a question in the chat of what kind of scanner would you suggest for slides or negatives? A lot of your basic flatbeds will come with attachments for slides and negatives. It's like one of them's a little like tent thing that has a mirror in it. And then negatives usually have kind of a plastic template thing that you push the negative in and then you can scan it. Those you're going to have to scan at a way higher resolution because of the fact that they're slides or negatives. So you're probably going to have much larger files. So I'm always much more selective when I'm scanning slides or negatives. But I've only really used an Epson to do that, and it did just fine. And so I think any of your basic flatbeds would work for slides or negatives. But if you have a whole bunch, I would definitely look into sending them out to a service to do because it is time consuming. And like I said, you have to scan at a much higher resolution. And so much bigger files. It might be more cost effective to have a service do it for you. Any other questions? All right. I'm hearing the digital equivalent of crickets. So thank you for coming. I really appreciate this. And I hope everybody has a fantastic Easter weekend.